If Dave's comfortable.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, sounds good. So I'd like to welcome Dave. I'm not trying to slaughter your last name, but it looks like Svendsgaard.
That's right. Yeah.
So Dave is a senior environmental engineer, and I just learned today also a graduate of NC State. Go NC State.
Go Pack.
He's with EPA's Air Quality Policy Division. He has 20 years of experience in the field of new source review. So take it away, Dave.
All right. Thanks, Mark, and everyone. Glad to be here.
Sorry, Dave, that was me. I accidentally muted you.
Okay. Can you hear me?
You're good. I'm so sorry.
Okay, no problem. I am not a seasoned Zoom person, so sharing the presentation might take me a minute, but I wanted to say first, definitely we are excited about connecting in with, this portion of the stakeholder audience for this rule is the small business. And I think we typically in the NSR world often deal outside of the small business arena because we're dealing with major NSR actions. This is one of the rare times we're delving into the minor NSR world. So clearly it's a broader audience, still involves the bigger entities, but I think now we're talking about, a lot of folks that often we don't have as much exposure to. So looking forward to hearing your feedback. I want to make sure, did you guys get the slides earlier today? You did not get any. Okay.
Yes, actually we did, and I put them in the Outlook invitation. So I don't know if I presume that if the invitation is adjusted or edited, that people would get a notation or notice that there was an update to the agenda. But yeah, I did include them in the agenda. So
I don't see them in there, Mark. So we might just have to share them when we send the minutes out afterwards.
Okay, sure.
But if you're having problems sharing, I can help talk you through sharing if you would like that.
The basics of it. Yeah. I'm not holding up my end of the
no, you're good. So if you see the share screen button, it should be green, probably on the bottom of your screen. Yeah. Might be at the top, depending on how you have yours set up. And then the thing about that is you just want to make sure that you pick the right one. So it should show you all of your tabs that you have open. So you should be able to just choose the one that you want. And even if it's not in presentation mode, you should be able to put it in presentation mode for us fairly easily.
Okay. That's the problem. I apologize.
No, you're fine.
I am not seeing, I have the presentation up, but it's not showing up on my available.
Do you see the thing that says show all windows? Like if you go to the share screen button, there should be like a thing kind of down to the right will say show all windows. So you might not have all the windows showing right away.
I don't see that at all.
Dave, I can share it if it'll help. And then you just let me know when to advance the slides.
Okay, great. Rhonda, I appreciate that. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you for bailing me out. So we are good on that front. So I did want to just run through a few other things just in, this is early engagement. This is all pre-decisional. We are trying to share with you our thoughts on where we might be going with trying to look at these rules that support the public notice components of the minor NSR rules, as well as some of the other pieces of the program. We'll just go through the slides with this group. I mean, if you want to, what we've been doing, and it's been with larger groups, we've been allowing people to submit questions as we go through in the chat box, and then we go through those at the end. I think we could still do that as well, but yeah, I might need a little help finding the chat box in this case. But there's just some components that are just some standard lawyery things that there's FACA. We want to make sure that we're getting your individual input. So I know you all represent different agencies, so we're trying to avoid collaborative type input at this point. And then also just, you know, the PRA, the asking questions. We're basically sharing our information, and you guys are free to give us whatever feedback you see as far as what you've been presented today. And beyond that, if there's anything, you know, I know we have an hour, and hopefully we're able to get through everything plus your questions in an hour. But if there's anything question-wise, if you have afterwards, my email is in the presentation, as well as, you know, if you have additional input, you can provide that up to, I don't know, end of November. We're saying about 2 weeks would be great. But if there's some additional things you think about later, or just want to share, if there's data you have, that would even be better. We're really looking for as specific as possible input from folks. So you guys might have some of that information that would be helpful to us to understand the small business side of things. But yeah, I mean, so that's the main thing. And I guess the goal would be for me to go through all the slides, and then, yeah, we'll just deal with the questions at the end. And I apologize, these didn't go out earlier, but some of you may have seen these because we have presented to both APCA and NACA. And so I don't know if some of those folks shared these with some of you all in your agencies. But okay, so we can go to the next slide, Rhonda. This is just an outline of really kind of what we're trying to go through. We'll talk a little bit about the program. I don't want to over assume that everybody here knows about what part of the program we're talking about. So I'll go through that, and then we'll go through basically what we're looking at for possibilities for this rulemaking and or guidance. And then we'll talk about questions at the end. Yeah. So just again, just trying to share our initial thinking about this and getting your experiences, context, perspectives that you have particular to small business interests that could help us form our decisions as we move forward. Again, there's my email if you want to communicate with me after this. Next slide. Okay, just from a very simplistic standpoint, the Clean Air Act has two different programs that support air permits. One is the New Source Review Program. The other one is the Title V Operating Permits Program. So agencies have both of those programs. What we're talking about here is the Pre-Construction Review Program, which is the New Source Review Program. And in particular, as I mentioned before, I think when we were talking, the Major NSR program is typically what we spend our time doing rules around, like the fugitive emissions rule, for example, that would apply to the PSD program. But for this case, we're talking about the yellow box. So it's the things that are not major NSR activities, smaller types of emission activities that are happening both at attainment and at non-attainment areas within the state. Next slide. The Minor NSR program essentially is just derived from one passage out of the Clean Air Act, and it's Section 110 A2C, which says that states should have programs that regulate doesn't say permit, which says regulate the modification and construction of any stationary source and that is necessary to assure that the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, are achieved. So that is the one passage that is the defining, underpinning for the Minor NSR program. When that was created, which was back in 1970, it applied to all permits because there was no such thing as a major and minor NSR program at that point. That didn't come along until 1977. So this was the passage that was put in 1970. There were parts C and D that added the major NSR program, again, 7 years later. This was never modified. And by and large, this is still the defining piece that we run our program off of. The Minor NSR program thus is regulating any construction of a new source or a modification of an existing source when its emissions or its emissions increase do not meet the thresholds of the major NSR program. And those are listed below. I won't go through all of them, but some of them derive from statute and others are like the significant emissions threshold is something that we have through regulation. So next slide. So again, the Minor NSR program, by and large, there's permits that are issued for this, but there's nothing in the statute that requires a permit to be issued for your Minor NSR activities. But by and large, programs have things that are getting permits and things that are not. That cut point of what doesn't get a permit is basically established through a program demonstration that's done that establishes what things getting a permit or things that the program determines are essential to maintaining and attaining the NAAQS. Anything that is below that, so it's basically these exclusions, which are typically like a ton per year exclusion or sometimes a source category exclusion. Those things are things that do not get a permit and are basically deemed to not be essential to maintaining the NAAQS. Again, basically what the Clean Air Act says the program must do. The new source review program is pollutant specific. So sources may, in some cases, have an event that gets them a major NSR permit for certain pollutants, and then one or two. And then maybe several other pollutants that they're emitting are under the thresholds, and so they would get a minor NSR permit for that same type of construction. Next slide. For the states, the requirements that we've set forth through the program, and these were essentially set up in 1973. And again, that was well before the major NSR program was put into effect. But basically, states should have a mechanism by which to determine if there is construction and it's going to cause or contribute to a violation of an NAAQS, then they would be able to prevent that construction. So you have an ability to deny any construction that you see would be an air quality concern. Again, programs to be set up by defining some exclusions for what gets permits and what do not, based on the type and size of projects that are subject to pre-construction review. And then for anything that is getting a permit, our rules specify that there needs to be at least a 30-day public review and comment on the permit application, the draft permit decision, and the agency's analysis of the project's effect on ambient air quality. And so these are the rules, again, that were set up generally in 1973, and they kind of got moved to another section maybe in the early 80s, but really have not been amended other than about 5 years ago when we said, well, you don't have to public notice through a newspaper, you can do it electronically. And so that was established essentially actually more like a decade ago, and then it was codified in rules about in 2016. So by and large, we think that most people are going through the process of, most agencies are going through the process of doing it on an electronic basis, but we hear that there are still newspaper advertisements that are done, and maybe that's through a state rule requirement or whatever, but it's not required if you're doing it electronically. So general permits and permits by rule, basically these template type permits that are established by some agencies to streamline the process of issuing permits to things that are of a similar nature. We know that many agencies have these in place. We ourselves, EPA has general permits that we use for minor NSR activity on tribal lands that we're permitting. These are generally set up where there is a 30-day notice period when the general permit is set in place. So, you know, promulgation of the general permit itself goes through a public review process. But then at the time in which coverage is being granted, sources are not subject to, or those coverage is not going through any public review process. And then we know that some air agencies use their operating permit program. So like under the Title V program or the federally enforceable state operating permits program, they use that to authorize actions that are otherwise subject to major NSR or minor NSR. So it's a pre-construction type thing, but it's going through maybe the minor mod process of the Title V, for example. Umbrella. So that would be more of a post hoc type public notice situation in that case, because that would not get public noticed until the renewal of Title V. Next slide. So our project that we're working on for this is to look at the minor NSR program. Again, for state and local agencies, we're not looking at the one under Part 49, which is Indian country. It's be Part 51, and really to make sure that the program itself is accountable. It protects the NAAQS, which is a requirement from the Clean Air Act, and then also transparent, so that the public has an opportunity to participate meaningfully in the permit process. And what does that mean? I mean, does it mean in all permit situations? I mean, I think that's what we're really trying to get to, is when is transparency more critical than other times? The regulatory agenda, which is the semi-annual thing that is issued by, well, EPA contributes to it and says what rules we're working on. This was added this past spring. Should be updated probably pretty soon here for the fall edition of the regulatory agenda. Right now, we're anticipating a proposal date of July 2023. And again, this is under the 40 CFR Part 51 section of 160 to 161 are the rules that are in play. And basically, you are part of the stakeholder engagement sessions that started really just a couple of weeks ago with NACA and APCA. We've spoken to some environmental groups the last 2 weeks, and then you're really our first foray into to speaking with industry, interests. We're going to be speaking a little bit more to some industry folks in the coming weeks right after Thanksgiving. Next slide. And the focus of this project, again, mainly the public notice and comment requirements. That's kind of why we got here to begin with. We've been these in 3 different types of categories: synthetic minor sources, modifications at major stationary sources, and true minor sources. You folks might be aware there was a synthetic minor report that was issued about 12 months ago or so that we're responding to. That's kind of part of why we're here and looking at this closely. There's been other issues related to SIP approvability that have led us to getting to this place. But Anyway, so beyond that, we're also looking at basically the measures that are taken by agencies to protect the NACs, including their program demonstrations. Again, those things that establish what the exclusions are from permitting, as well as the air quality impact analysis assessments that are done for individual permit actions, as well as through just the general permit process, both at the inception of creating the general permit and then over time as coverage is getting granted. We're looking at really the procedural requirements for general permits and permits by rule. Currently, there are no regulatory requirements for this in Part 51. And so this is kind of a void that has caused us, again, some issues with SIP approvability. So we're looking into that. And then just some other aspects of the minor NSR rule provisions that relate to public review, participation, and really just accountability. And again, this pre-decisional, based on these interactions with you all and other groups, we will determine whether to propose to amend our regulations and also possibly issue some guidance to achieve our desired outcomes. Next slide. All right, yeah, so public notice for synthetic minor sources, you folks might be aware, but these are the types of minor NSR actions that are requesting enforceable limitations on their physical operational capacity. This is typically to avoid major NSR, which has a lot more the bells and whistles, a lot more involved type of process and controls required. Potentially offsets if you're non-attainment. Also, Title V applicability, sometimes folks prefer to not be subject to Title V. The synthetic minor term itself is kind of loosely used. Well, it can mean several things. And so some of which are just the greenfield sources that are coming in and trying to avoid major NSR typically by taking a limit. This is in a lot of cases oil and gas production that might be taking limits right below the 250 ton per year threshold and getting some sort of restrictions on the operations to do so. There's also modifications that are of a synthetic minor. Basically you're going in and it's not a greenfield source, it's a modification, but it's getting a synthetic minor to remain below potentially maybe the significant emissions rate, which is required for major NSR triggering. And then there's the amendments, which you may already have a synthetic minor permit, and for whatever reason, you either want to increase it by a little bit, or maybe you want to decrease it to get some headroom or to avoid maybe permitting if you're getting underneath the exemption threshold within your state. Again, currently our rules as they're written say that anything that is getting a synthetic minor permit and is part of your program, it requires a 30-day public notice. We know that some agencies have looked at synthetic minors in different ways and have different cut points based on either 80% or 90% of the major source threshold. That above that level, then they will either on a discretionary basis or otherwise provide public notice and review. And then we also, just as we mentioned before, some of these synthetic minor sources are currently being permitted through the PSOP programs in states. So this is because these types of sources, at least some subset of the synthetic minor sources, are attempting to avoid major NSR, and they're basically creating enforceable conditions to do so. We think that this is a category of permits that should be subject to a greater level of scrutiny, potentially more transparency and accountability. And so this is just, again, our discussion point that we want your input on. And we also know that there are other smaller emitting synthetic minor sources, as I mentioned, like amendments that may not warrant that level of attention. Okay, next slide. So modifications at major stationary sources. So these are, where you have a major large stationary source, a refinery, a petrochemical facility, large facility that has probably gotten a major NSR permit when it was built. Well, over time, it's still not necessarily going to get major NSR permits. It may be getting minor NSR actions. And some of these actions could include just expansions of the facility, replacement of different pieces of equipment as they're going along, or adding new equipment. So making sure that the projects at these major sources are not subject to major NSR would necessarily include the applicant going in and looking at the major NSR requirements and saying, okay, well, we're projecting emissions that are not going to cause us to trigger major NSR, which would be based on the significant emissions rate, which in many cases is like 40 tons per year for NOx, the VOC, for example. They also have other components of the major NSR program in play, like project aggregation, netting, so taking advantage of shutdown credits, and then debottlenecking. So a number of things that are part of the major NSR program come into play when you're trying to say that your modification at a major stationary source is not subject to major NSR. We think, I guess just kind of skipping to the bottom, because of that, this is a similar type of category, we feel, as really the synthetic minor sources that are also trying to take certain conditions, take limits that would avoid major NSR. So we think that because of that, these are, again, in a category of permits that may warrant additional transparency and accountability. And then we also know that there's probably areas of this that are very small emitting things, or people are just putting in an emergency generator at a big facility, and it's not as consequential as far as air quality goes. So trying to get your thoughts around how this goes. A lot of these are Title V sources anyway, so they might be getting permitted on a regular basis just through that process, which might have additional transparency, even if they're not required to get something through their major or through their minor NSR program. Next slide. Okay, so the final category is the true minor sources, which is also, some call them natural minors. These are sources that by definition would never be triggering major NSR under any situation. They're 87, 60 hours per year should allow them to avoid major NSR requirements. So by and large, we think that this is a category where there's probably a lot more activity going on with states, and it's where they're issuing permits for very little things, little small emitting things that are of less concern. We do think that there are potentially some true minor source activity that could result in more concern, and those are listed here. Basically, if you have something that's emitting up to 249 tons per year, or things that are being located in a source or an area which already has a high background concentration of an axe pollutant, and you're contributing to more. And then just if there's multiple permitting being done in a discrete area, in a frequent level, just within a small window of time, we think that might raise concerns from a cumulative emission standpoint. Even if it's just true minor sources and they may not be emitting all the way up to, the highest thresholds. So we feel like this is one of the areas that I think flexibility should exist, where I think, we think that there are some areas of this bin where there might be higher concern, but compared to the other two that we just talked about, this is probably an area that states, generally need more flexibility as far as public notice goes, as well as air quality analysis and some of the other features of the program. Next slide. Okay, so mentioned before, just general permits by rule. These are being used in many states, and in many states they are used almost exclusively. 95% of some permitting actions in some states are being done through general permits. So they're definitely a useful tool in what states rely on to help streamline their process. As I mentioned, we do not have any rules, mainly because our rules are 49 years old, and I don't think they ever envisioned needing something like this when they were created. So we feel like it's important to put in some basic framework into our rules that would support a program for general permits and permits by rule that would be both accountable and transparent, but would still allow for the, effectiveness of the streamlining that allows agencies to, reduce resources for these types of events. So, one of these things would be looking at best practices for developing and promulgating the general permit at the beginning, and then also best practices for granting coverage to individual sources as they're implementing the general permit. We think that it's important at that time for the public to be aware that coverage is getting granted. It doesn't mean that there's a comment period, but just that on this date, we granted coverage to this permit. And again, that's a transparent component of it that we don't think is that big of a hurdle. Just looking at the processes that we have used for tribal NSR general permits to see if those would be suitable for air agencies to apply. And then just, some of those permits that we talked about before, like synthetic minor permits, modifications at major stationary sources, if those are being done through a general permit action, typically those are not getting any public review at the time of coverage. And so we would, I guess, like to explore whether those types of things need additional procedural steps before granting coverage. And then really the idea that general permits in a lot of cases are set forth and then they're never reevaluated. Like 10 years later, when you're setting up general permit, you do not know how much typically it's going to be used. So if you find out that there's a lot of growth in your area and they've used a lot of general permits, then looking at maybe the potential for reauthorizing the general permit through some public review process over time. Next slide. So program demonstrations, again, these are the things that are setting that cut point as to what gets a permit and what does not in different agencies. These are generally, ton per year thresholds, different categories of sources that are exempted from permitting. A lot of these program demonstrations were submitted and approved by EPA many, many years ago, probably at the inception of the states creating their permitting programs. Some have been updated since that time, but our thought is that it makes some sense, since the NAAQS has evolved over time, gone to short-term averages, it would certainly make sense to have some reauthorization or at least a relook at the different program demonstrations. That would necessarily probably require us to give some sort of guidance on that front, because again, in a lot of states, they have not looked at this for 40 years or so. Maybe the exemptions would change the basis for the exemptions would change depending on whether you had a non-attainment area or an attainment area. Our tribal rule does have different exemptions depending on what your designation of your area is. So again, maybe we would apply some of that to in thinking about program demonstrations for states. Next slide. And then just there's other areas of the program that relate to permit review that we think at least we'd like to understand what the best practices are. I mean, this would include public hearings and public meetings. Our rules do not specify that that's required for minor NSR, but I know that some states do that on some discretionary basis. So understanding that process, really getting to the transparency piece of it is, apart from just public comment periods, but making accessible searchable databases of the information, the permit decisions, the applications, the source locations, any air quality analysis, all the permit information available on an agency's website, so that if somebody is interested in commenting on a permit, or if they're just interested in what permit was just issued in their area, whether there was comment availability or not, they could go and at least see what that permit basis was. In addition, we think that on the minor NSR front, it's often not as clear to the public as to if they're concerned about a permit action, how to appeal that or to challenge it, the administrative and legal remedies. So just making that more clear, we think is an important piece of the program for transparency. And then understanding the concept that some agencies allow for, in a lot of cases, just for the true minor sources, but for them to public notice the permit application in lieu of the permit, a draft permit itself. So in a lot of cases, this is done where they allow the permit application to be noticed, and then they gauge interest. And then if there is interest expressed, then they would go forward and public notice the draft permit. But if there's none, then they would just go straight forward to finalizing the permit. Anyway, we think that's a creative way for states to approach that, and also, obviously streamlining the process for many states. Next slide. All right, and then just other parts that relate to the accountability of the program. Again, like the air quality analysis, that is, when do states typically call for an air quality analysis? Either they do it themselves or they have the applicant do it. Is this being done more so for synthetic minor type sources, or is it done just in urban areas? Understanding that when that's being done, by and large, the modeling itself is discretionary under our terms of our rules right now. It's you just need to have some sort of a air quality type of analysis. So in many cases, it stops short of modeling. But we know that modeling can't occur for every minor NSR action. So we're trying to get a better handle on that, as well as just making sure that states do have the authority to prevent construction if they determine it's going to interfere with an act. That's in our rules right now. What we're finding, though, is that some states don't have that express authority. And then I think that might be it. Is that the, yeah, okay. So I'm seeing a couple of chat statements coming in, and I'm happy to try to review those. They're just, okay.
So I can read the one that's in there out loud for you while you kind of think about it, Dave, just so everybody can hear. So it says, can you give an example of multiple sources in the same discrete area having a significant cumulative effect on the NACs? Haven't the states been handling this scenario just fine for the past 30+ years? So I did think that was interesting that you guys are tying it back specifically to that, but not necessarily addressing cumulative impacts and risk and how to evaluate that. So I don't know if you can even speak to that kind of first question, but if you can, that'd be great.
Sure. No, I appreciate it. So this is from Tony. Yeah. Well, there are examples that I hear anecdotally. The one that's more set in my mind is the example of West Texas, where there's a lot of oil and gas permitting in the Permian Basin, maybe also expands over into New Mexico. There's right now a discretionary redesignation that EPA is undertaking to look at that and determine whether, in fact, the monitoring values that are showing there, which I think have been progressively increasing for about a 5-year period over the design values, that those would be, that would be an area where there's been intensive permitting, most exclusively minor NSR type of permit actions, all oil and gas related, and where there's certainly potentially not just a NACS problem, but it's a potential redesignation. There's a lot of other anecdotal things we hear coming in from environmental groups through SIP approvals. A lot of them are also related to oil and gas. But I would say that that's the more concrete example of something where we've actually taken some action.
Well, and I can
beginning to take action.
That seems like it makes sense, at least from, not even related to what you're here to talk about, but from the perspective of having something from the same industry type in a specific area where you could see direct results on air monitoring. So I'm thinking, and I know this is a little outside of this, but like with the ETO projects and initiatives where we're seeing, elevated risk on air monitoring and in the NADA data and things like that, where there's a direct correlation. And so I guess, Tony, I don't know if you want to add on anything, but I guess where my mind went on kind of this whole conversation is because I deal very directly and intimately with public comment on a daily basis here, I'm just wondering about so two things. Number one, does EPA, and they are, if you can't answer this, maybe you can't, but do they feel that a lot of the states have been applying the rule about public comment for NSR sources in general? Because I know here we don't public comment minor sources, and we only public comment synthetic minor sources of a certain kind or sources of known public controversy. So we have three kind of specific categories, but I don't know in my over 20 years of being here that we've ever public commented a true minor source. And then that's kind of part one. And then the second part of that is like, how does the public comment process in general help improve compliance with the NACs or improve air quality? I mean, I think sometimes maybe it does, but because we're so limited in changes that we can make on permitting, because a lot of our statutes don't necessarily allow us to say, no, that can't be here if it is complying with rules and regulations, unless it's, very rarely can we say no. So like, I guess I'm trying to see, like, I get what you're saying, but then what is the outcome that we're looking for? If we were implementing all the things you talked about, what is the outcome, or what do we expect to see out of all of this?
Those are great questions. Regarding your first one, just is EPA, determining that states are not doing the right things. I mean, there's a disconnect with what our rules are saying and what states, well, not all states, but different practices that have evolved over time, and in many cases have been approved by EPA, maybe 30 years ago, and that was fine. I mean, so our rules are saying 30 days is required. If you're not doing that, then what's become a problem has been this approving SIPs. Anything under the Minor NSR program, if you're going through something that has nothing to do with public notice, we will try to approve a SIP related to some other piece of the program. And, we're getting hung up on the fact that, well, the 30 days isn't getting applied, even though it's not at issue in your, what you're trying to get approved. So we're trying to resolve that disconnect, that our rules are probably an artifact of some idea in 1973 that was serving a permitting program that nobody really knew what was, how to function and structure it. So I mean, I'll just say that we're trying to find, okay, well, if it's not 30 days for everything, which is kind of what it says, everything that's deemed a permit worthy by your program demonstration, then what is that balance? Is it nothing, which some states are doing, or is it something short of that? And so that's our reason why we're trying to bend things in ways that we're seeing, that there might be some benefit to pushing ourselves, to some sort of better set of rules that would focus on those things and not the really small things that we know just need to not have that level of attention. So we're trying to do that. I mean, the synthetic, or that report by the OIG on our synthetic minor things, it pointed to this. It didn't say we had to do anything other than to resolve it, and that's what we're trying to do now. But apart from that, I mean, we do think that minor NSR actions mean more on an air quality perspective than they did 50 years ago when those rules were created. So, I mean, we just see that, the major NSR rule gets a lot of attention, rules and actions get a lot of attention, and they're getting offsets, and they're getting, a lot more controls on the minor NSR front, which is orders of magnitude more activity, hundreds of more permits per year than what you're getting, or 100 times more permits you get than major source. So we're thinking that there's more of those types of emissions that are kind of needing to get more looks at. So what that means for us, and and how it equates to public notice, I think is what we're also trying to understand. Public notice for the sake of public notice, I don't think is getting us anywhere. But if it's on things that we effectively all agree, oh, these are the higher emitting minor sources, these are the things that are of bigger concern, then
but I think those things change. Like, so for example, here we have, it seems like anytime we have an asphalt plant recently, because we've had some very controversial ones in environmental justice areas, that we're being asked every time, by our stakeholders. So if we want to make changes at this asphalt plant, does it have to go out for comment? Well, it doesn't. Most of the time, those facilities wouldn't necessarily fall within those three things that require comment here, unless it's a known source of controversy, which we always look at on an area specific basis. So I think that I appreciate that you're talking about building that flexibility in. I think one of the things that we hear from our industry stakeholder groups, not one of the things, like the major thing that we hear from them, and you've probably heard this before, but I'm saying this collectively for this group because we do small business assistance, is the time it takes to issue permits. And so, like, anything, especially public comment on smaller air emission sources, if we start telling people we are going to have to incorporate in an additional minimum of 30 days, 30 more days for them to get their permits to install, that's a big deal for a small business who's working on very small margins, right? So, and I'm not advocating either way because I can't speak for my state. I think I could speak for my state, but I'm not going to. But I think like that's one of the things that we're going to hear about as assistance providers is like, okay, now how do I accommodate this new ask, or you know, how does that fit in with me trying to even figure out how to get a permit for this small paint booth or whatever it is in the first place. So I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that, but that was the thing that kind of raised it up for me as a assistance provider, is like, how do I communicate that, and how much pushback are we going to get from the groups we work with? And it was funny that you said something about how this rule was written a long time ago and how the SIPs have been approved without the 30 days. It just reminds me of the legislature like sneaking like things, or not putting things in there when they're supposed to. Just where we are now, because we just had election day last week. So does anybody else have any thoughts on that? Because I always certainly have more questions, but y'all don't want to hear me just talk. And we have one other thing we have to do, so we probably have to wrap it up in like 2 minutes. Mark, what do you say on that?
It sounds good. And I mean, as long as we have time, I wouldn't say that you needed to mute yourself. I mean,
Yeah,
if
Olivia has her hand up, so we might as well. We should.
Oh
probably
yeah,
let
yeah.
her-
Go ahead to her.
Go ahead, Olivia.
Just a quick note about what Jennifer said. I just came back from a class, and the name of the class was risk communication, and it was mainly based on environmental justice area, and a lot of the public hearings that were played just to show us how people react to issuing a permit or environmental issues in their neighborhood. So some of them presented a lot of scenarios where people around the area was getting cancer, and they showed doctors this. And so at the end of the communication, I asked them, okay, so what do we do from here? The information is compelling, but as a permit writer, I've done all I can do. The strictest condition has been put, but there is an issue. What else can I do? There is not much we can do after following all the regulations in the book.
Right. Is this, I mean, consistent with Jennifer's point that, yeah, I mean, there's just so much, if they're compliant with an act, or if they're, in this case, there might be more of an air toxics thing, if it's risk that if they're meeting the standards, you know, that's the, yeah, where the hook is for minor NSR is kind of honestly a big question. There's not a control technology requirement like factor layer. There's the air quality component is, I'd say, flexible, just be
well,
honest.
and then you talked about general permits, which could be a whole nother conversation, because I know we public comment those when they're issued, but I think that you're absolutely right about like, okay, well, good, that one's done. Let's not look at it again, because we know things might have changed that might either somewhat nullify those that have been issued, or change it so much that people can't use it. And then that creates a permit backlog for our engineers, which, you know, there's this whole sort of like downhill role that we could potentially have on all of this. But it is, I put a note in the chat for you, Dave, like it is a very interesting, and it's a very tough conversation that I imagine that you're having with people. I do have like a whole list of questions while you're talking, but I know this is not the conversation for that. I'm just going to push it up the chain here. And I know that our folks are bringing that to the attention of EPA. But Mark, do you have any closing remarks? I don't want to stop things too, but I know we do have like one other quick thing we have to do before our meeting gets done at 3.
Well, there's nothing that says that we can't revisit this issue or in more depth. And maybe Dave could come back, or maybe
he might
he has
not want to.
or maybe he has a colleague that would be able to come back and we could get into more depth. I could talk
Yeah.
about a bunch of stuff too. When it comes to permitting, and again, I'm not really looking at his level as far as news source review.
Mhm.
I'm looking at the true minors, the very small businesses like body shops where there's, a plethora of them. And they're not really very knowledgeable about permitting. So they want something simple. And I'm thinking something that's more menu driven, where they can kind of pick and choose like a cafeteria style, a listing of best management practices. And it might be very simple practices like, monitoring solvent usage, or waste generation, fuel usage, et cetera, et cetera. But Dave, I do appreciate you getting on and giving this presentation today. And Rhonda, I thank you very much for suggesting this topic and suggesting Dave. And I guess without further ado, we can go to our poll. And this is kind of important because we want to figure out, do we meet next month?
Or do we not meet next month? What would you guys like to do? And just so that we don't have a agenda item, we could probably talk about this. We could talk behind Dave's back and then send him a bunch of information questions that we have. So we definitely could find things to talk about, but that means the rest of you have to talk, not just me and Mark. So we get tired of hearing ourselves. Neither one of us have good voices. So, it's one of those things.
We do have a topic. We do have a couple of topics, one in January, thanks to Jennifer.
Yes, but not for December. We don't have anything on our agenda yet.
But again, it's not too early to talk about January, the Safer Chemical Program.
Yep.
I did have a joke about that.
Oh, no.
We could have a New Year's resolution to use safer chemicals, and then Janet could tell us in January whether, our resolution is good or not.
We can tell her what safer chemicals we think we should use, and she'll tell us yes or no. That would be interesting.
Yeah. Like, use more lacquer thinner.
Right.
So something else had come up, actually, Angela Hughes with Oklahoma. She kind of responded to a question I posed regarding the disposition of so-called expired hand sanitizer. And I guess hand sanitizer may not necessarily deteriorate into something else. So, but apparently in Oklahoma and even Indiana, there have been some fires just due to the mishandling. And it could have been, perfectly good sanitizer, but it is a flammable, ethanol and or isopropyl alcohol. So that's a potential topic that will take place. Looks like in February. So, do we get our poll results?
Yeah, Abigail, can you share those? Thank you. So it looks like the cancel the meetings have it, Mark, which I think is fine. I mean, it's very close to the holidays, and I know you guys probably would rather party than come here and talk to us for sure. So are you all right with that, Mark, or do you want me and you can just meet and hang out?
I'm all right with that. I saw Jennifer's comment, Jennifer Figure.
Yep.
Yeah, we saw that. It was like, okay, well, 2 to 3, that's when Region 5. And then it was kind of like, we can't even meet 1 to 2 as far as Eastern Standard Time. So it was going to be noon to 1. And that might be a bit early for many people.
Yep.
But we did get the second most ranking was the 3 to 4 on December 13th. But yeah, I think this probably works out well. I mean, unless someone really has a burning desire to meet to talk about maybe burning, or I don't know. I know one year we had there was a new rule, and we kind of met to talk about comments for that rule, but that was about it. So yeah,
I don't think we have anything like pressing burning. We don't have any burning topics, so we're probably good to cancel. So we'll plan on doing that. I see a lot of people are dropping off and it's after 3. So,
Okay.
but
Sounds-
thank you guys for listening in. That was good. If you have thoughts on other things to send to Dave and to Rhonda on that topic, or if you have anything from your states or your agencies, feel free to pass that on to Mark and I, and we can kind of consolidate things and pass it up the chain too. So, all right. Well, that being said, I will see y'all in a couple months. See you in the new year. How about that?
Yeah. Happy Thanksgiving,
Yeah.
Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Kwanzaa, Happy New Year. And I'm probably forgetting 3 or 4 other
Yeah, probably.
holidays as well.
All right, y'all. Take care.
Take care.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.